Hi, I'm Fran and I'm Head of Research at More Than Equal, and welcome to the next session of our Track Talks webinar series. Formula One is one of the biggest mixed gender sports in the world, but we haven't seen a woman competing on the grid in nearly 50 years. Here at More Than Equal, we look at other high performance mixed gender environments where women were not once welcome to see what we can learn from their journeys. From equestrian sports to sailing, even going outside of sport into fields of business and science, women and girls have made significant strides in breaking the glass ceiling. Today, we are very excited to welcome Rosie Steevenson and Helen Seymour, who both served in the Royal Air Force. This is one of the most physically gruelling, male-dominated environments out there, with fighter jet pilots experiencing acceleration forces as high as 9 Gs. Helen was the first ever female Typhoon pilot in the Royal Air Force before continuing to serve as a fighter pilot for over 20 years. Rosie flew as a navigator in the Tornado F3, mastering the art of air combat and quick reaction alert missions. So, military aviation, it's one of the most male-dominated environments out there, industries out there. What drew you to that career, that journey in fighter aviation?
So I'm going to take you back to when I was 12 years old, and I'm sitting at the kitchen table with my dad, and he's reading a newspaper, and it's a broadsheet paper, one of the big papers, and he gets to the sort of centre of the paper, and he just stops and he says to me, "You have got to see this." And he turns the paper around, and what I can see is this basically giant advert that's been taken out by British Airways. And it's a very simple advert. It's a sunrise, and it's got the most beautiful colours, like all the colours of the rainbow. And it's just got 5 words on this advert, and it just says, "This could be your office." And around the outside of this sunrise are the cockpit displays, and I just look at this picture and I'm immediately transported into that aircraft. And I just think to myself, that's what I want to do, and my focus of attention from that moment on is on flying. So I go on to join the Air Cadets. I spend a number of years in the Air Cadets, and then I go on to university. I study aerospace engineering because I just want to maximise my chances of getting into that environment, and join the University Air Squadron. And the rest, as they say, is history.
Wow. And what about you, Helen?
I am afraid to say that I wasn't as committed as Rosie. Mine's a little bit more or less traditional. So I joined the Air Cadets, and I did start flying, and I loved it, which did make me think I definitely want to be in the Air Force. But as I went to sixth form, I decided I wanted to apply for a cadetship, but I failed the tests. So they said, "No, sorry, this time you can't be a pilot," which made me go to a different route. And I thought, well, I'm going to go and read medicine because I want to be a doctor. My mum was super happy. She just had this dream of having a daughter as a doctor. But when I went to university, I decided actually I did like the idea of being in the military. I really liked the Air Force. So I joined the University Air Squadron. And this is my only experience of positive discrimination, and I'm not afraid to say that I definitely took the opportunity whilst it arose. But whilst I was at university and on the squadron, I wasn't supposed to fly because I was going to be joining the Air Force as a doctor. But that year, they said, "Helen, look, the Air Force were really honest. They said, we don't have enough girls on the books flying. That is just because there are certain proportions that you have to fit in a cockpit, and relatively girls have shorter arms than men, and I don't. I have very long arms. So they said, "Helen, you fit. Could you please? We know you're not supposed to be flying. Would you consider it?" And I obviously jumped at the chance, and that was it. I was hooked. I loved it. It was what I decided to do. Told my mum, "Sorry, mum, you're not going to have a daughter as a doctor. You're going to have one as a pilot instead." And again, like Rosie said, the rest is history.
So what were some of the significant obstacles that you faced on that journey, and how did you go about overcoming them?
I would say there are 2 that stick out for me. One is attitude, and the second is the aptitude test, which I just mentioned. I had to tell my mum I was going to finish reading medicine and become a pilot. And just to set the scene about my mum, she's amazing. She and her sister, my aunt, have brought me up because my dad died when I was really young. So my mum is a single mum. She's a real champion of women achieving and has always been there to say, "Helen, go for it. Just go for what you want to achieve." So I sat her down, and I think unfortunately, I think the disappointment of her realising that I wasn't going to be a doctor sort of set in. And the next thing I said to her is, Mum, I want to be a fighter pilot. And I was really interested by her response because I was expecting some sort of, yes, Helen, go for it, because that's normally what I would get from her. And actually said, Helen, don't be silly. Men do that. You can't be a fighter pilot, you're a woman. And that really took me aback because I was expecting something very different. And I think that wasn't really necessarily her attitude. I just think that was the attitude of the time because, to put it in context, women had only really started flying fast jets for, I think the first one was 6 years before that, so it was really new. And so I think that sort of attitude would be the first obstacle that I first faced. And then the second obstacle is the aptitude test. I mean, these tests are designed to test your essay, your situational awareness, your reflexes, your ability to multitask. And they're tricky. And like I said, I failed the first one. And you're only able to do 2. And then that's it. You can't apply again. So I felt the pressure was really on. And as a 16-year-old, I think that's quite, 16, 17-year-old, that's pretty difficult. And as you can imagine, you're sitting at a computer desk. There's pictures, numbers, objects, different colours flying at you. You've got to stop them hitting the edge of the screen while doing something else, and it's really tricky, and the pressure was on. And actually, I did pass, and obviously did go on to be a pilot. So I would say attitude and the realisation that you've got to pass, tests under pressure, I think were the two biggest obstacles for me at the time.
And what about you, Rosie? What were your key obstacles?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think attitude is so important, and I was very fortunate in that my dad in particular was a real aviation enthusiast, and he just encouraged me every step of the way, as did my mum. But I think probably the biggest obstacle for me was it came more from the medical side of things. So I'm quite petite, and when I went for my aircrew medical, I think I had to go 4 times at various stages. I was told to put on weight, I was told I was too small, I was told my arms weren't long enough. The best advice I had at the time was to stretch my arms by carrying heavy bags of shopping home from Sainsbury's when I was a student, or Tesco's or whatever, and it didn't work. So I kept going back to the medical and kept insisting that I'd been trying to stretch my arms. I managed to put the weight on. That part seemed to be quite straightforward as a student, the good old beer and kebab diet. But the stretching the arms part was harder. So I got remeasured a few times, but on I think the final occasion I managed to pass once. And then they said, no, you've got to come back because we're not convinced. We've got some new equipment in. And when I went in the final time, they'd got pressure pads that went behind your shoulders and you had to extend your arm. And the alarm went off if you overextended. So unfortunately, the official line was that I was too small to be a pilot. So that really sort of set me on my journey to becoming a navigator. But at that time, because I'd been on the University Air Squadron, I had kind of flown the navigational part of the pilot syllabus, and it had been my sort of best performing area, so it worked out pretty well for me. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the barriers definitely from a physical perspective, anthropometrically, so when we're looking at the length of your limbs, women are smaller and the aircraft are designed for men, or they certainly were at that time.
Has there been any change in the aircraft design?
No. And actually, it's interesting because I have been looking into this recently, and the anthropometric data that the Air Force uses is from a study of 1,000 men in 1970. And obviously, it's not just the cockpit, it's the kit. What's really good, though, is this year the Air Force has just commenced a study to looking at female-specific kit. Obviously, it's going to be hard to change the design of a jet that's already in service. But at least they're starting to realise that at least the kit that you wear and how you operate it and the differences between the male and the female form do need to be considered. So that's really positive.
Great.
Yeah, it's interesting because after I left the Air Force, I went on to study human factors and ergonomics. So it's quite a keen area of interest for me. I did an MSc in it. So it's, but back when they were designing these jets, and you think about user-centered design and inclusive design, well, women weren't flying fast jets at this time, so you can see why it wasn't a consideration. But hopefully moving forwards, it's been 25, 30 years since women have been flying fast jets. It definitely needs to be on the radar in terms of having a design that's inclusive. But it's not just, it's the kit that we wore, so it might be that gloves were it was difficult to get gloves small enough. I certainly had problems with my mask fit in terms of my face was just petite, so I had to have a specialist mask made, but it took a good 6 months of me having to shout out and say, there's a problem here, and just being told, no, there's no problem, you're fine, when actually, I had to end up having a specialist mask made. And even the thermal underwear was designed for men, so we'd wear men's long johns for quite a while, and just because that wasn't a consideration. And I think it extends, it's not just within aviation, you see it outside in different industries, so even high-flying surgeons, female surgeons have smaller hands again, so when they're operating and using instrumentation, they often might struggle to get grip just because of the size of their hands. And what happens is that people then compensate, and when they compensate, they end up with musculoskeletal disorders and then end up increasing the number of mistakes that are made potentially just because of all of these things, just because the design isn't necessarily inclusive. So it's not just about surviving, it's about thriving. And I think it's really important when we design systems to be as inclusive as possible, because if we want to get the best out of people, then we need to really consider them at the design phase.
Absolutely, and I guess if you don't, it just becomes cyclical, doesn't it? If you don't design systems that are appropriate, people never go in those systems, and so it perpetuates the issue essentially.
Yeah, they're put off, aren't they? Because actually, systemically, if you're not included, you know that you're going to have to work harder to get the system to work for you, and you have workarounds, and then people start to adapt the way that they work, which, as we're saying, if you're the wrong size for something, or you're not the wrong size, or the kit's the wrong size for you, you're trying to adapt and make it work for you, but it just makes things, it just adds that layer of complexity, I guess, to your everyday work.
Yeah, really interesting what you said about the fact that women may well begin to compensate, and the injuries and complications that happen as a result of that. That's problematic, isn't it?
Yeah, I've got a really good example of that. So when I was flying on operations out in LME, to liberate Libya, my sortie length was 8 hours, but I might be in the cockpit for 12 hours. And at the time, there wasn't really any provision for me to urinate. So how I compensated for that was just to dehydrate myself. And I'd got so good at it, I knew exactly the right level of dehydration that would allow me to operate for that amount of time without having to wee, but also not be so detrimental to my mental agility, to not cause me the impairment that would mean that it would degrade so much from my performance. But I shouldn't have to do that. That's not great physically for you or mentally, really. So I remember getting out of the jet, and I was ragingly thirsty and also really needed a wee at the same time, which was very strange because those two don't normally go hand in hand. So yeah, I think that it's really important that you don't, because that's a classic compensation where actually it's detracting from your own, it's taking capacity away from your ability to perform at the highest level.
A basic bodily function that we weren't able to perform, and I think, as you said, that you had to adapt your way of working to work around that. And it's really interesting because it's only since leaving the Air Force that I understand the detrimental effect of dehydration and just 2% dehydration. They say cognitively you can see a reduction in cognitive ability by sort of up to 20%, which is really significant. And it doesn't just suddenly drop off a cliff. It happens really, the onset's really gradual, so you don't notice it's happening. No. So it's and for the guys too, because let's face it, it's not always very easy for them to go to the loo when they need to. So it's another layer of complexity, I guess.
I think it's a difficult environment to work in, full stop. Yeah. And then where there are points where you have to also add workarounds. Any extra distraction is not needed when it's that high performance.
In a exceptionally
when
high
you're working
pressure,
as hard as you can and you're concentrating, you don't want to be worrying about extraneous things.
So what was female participation representation like when you were in that industry, and has that changed over recent years?
Yeah, we were discussing this yesterday, and actually it's been pretty stagnant.
Yeah, it sort of plateaued, didn't it?
It has.
Yeah.
I would say from the tornado, I think we sort of tried to think about some numbers, and we were wondering whether it was sort of 5%.
Sort of 5 to 10% probably female.
the entire aircrew community were female. And certainly from my perspective on Typhoon, I was joking that it's we're a bit like London buses, in that I was the first and then the only for 5 years, and then suddenly there were 5 of us, which was awesome because we managed to spread out across all the squadrons. Sounds like we're taking over the world. But it was nice to have a bit more of a cadre, I guess, because, Rosie's great. She's always had my back. We've been each other's mentor, but she was out of the Air Force at that point. So it was nice to have other like-minded individuals that I could, ask a question, and more probably the other way around, in that I was then the most experienced one. So they could probably come to me and ask advice, which, we did obviously, and we would help each other out. So I would say that, yes, there's only now probably one again on Typhoon, because as with men, everyone, turns over, people come and they go, they get promoted, they leave, they go and do other jobs. So it has really stagnated, hasn't it? It's not a lot. And actually a common question I get asked is, why are there not more women doing the job that you do? And I've never really had an answer for it, other than I think it stems from maybe it's just not something that's necessarily talked about as an option.
We're trying to go into schools and sort of spread the word a bit more, because certainly when we were in the Air Force, we were discouraged from doing that, in terms of, from a sort of media perspective, bringing attention to ourselves, I suppose, or bringing attention upon ourselves. So we're trying to just elevate, I guess, and highlight that these are jobs that women can do and have done, and just to give children something tangible, and for the boys too, to have those conversations with their sisters and their parents and their friends, because it's getting people talking about it. We don't really know what has stopped the numbers increasing. But I mean, I suppose the barriers are still there, the physical barriers are still there in terms of passing the medicals and things. There was definitely a disproportionate number of females failing the medical when I went through university. I think pretty much everyone in my year group failed because of the arm length. That was definitely an issue. So there are still barriers there which potentially are putting people off, but there's probably a bit more to it than that, which potentially we don't know the answers to.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because generally, once you have the role models and visibility, more come. But because of the nature of the job that you were doing, you can't necessarily shout from the rafters about that. So you can't build up that visibility. Yeah, so you have people doing it, but you can't necessarily showcase that.
And I guess it's also, I think the parallels with Formula One are that it's an extremely competitive arena to get into for anyone. And I think when I joined, maybe it was 3,000 candidates for one cockpit. So I think that if you then take a small proportion of women applying, and then you add the same ratio of failures or whatever, you do end up with just a really small proportion, don't you? And I think it's worth saying that it's, there's a high chop rate in either fields, isn't there? I think it's good as well, and I'm really hopeful for the young girls that are entering this project, because I think as a society as a whole now, everyone is much more happy to, and also encouraged to, put their head above the parapet. Whereas I think maybe 15, 20 years ago when we were starting, maybe that wasn't so encouraged, I think, and I certainly didn't feel like I was able to do that, because I didn't want to. I was already different. Not that I ever had any negativity, like I said, but you yourself know that you are slightly different to the norm. And I think if you put your head above the parapet, that's always...
I didn't even like asking for an oxygen mask, because, it's one of those things where you're different and, you're smaller, and you just don't want to be seen as the person who's making a fuss, because...
I guess you never want to give anyone any ammunition to throw at you, because you may feel as if you are already vulnerable, maybe, because you're in that minority.
You stand out, yeah.
But I think nowadays that's not necessarily the case anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's some parallel research with female engineers, which is also typically male-dominated, where they will often not speak up about problems or things that they're struggling with, because they don't want to be seen any different to the men. Yeah. So then you have people sort of dealing with things and putting up with things that don't necessarily need to.
The instrumentation and the tools that they're using, they're not going to highlight when they can't get good grip control and things, because they don't want to highlight what they see as a shortfall, which is a systemic shortfall. It's not due to them as an individual. They can't help how they were born.
So they're currently doing the research to look at the female body, how it fits to the equipment, etc., the cockpit. How long do you think it will be before the output of that research is seen?
It's difficult because the military research and development program is not the fastest. So the honest answer is I don't know.
How many generations of manned aircraft are there as well in terms of?
I would say it's very unlikely to have a cockpit designed with the female in mind. I think it's very likely that there will be kit that is designed with the female form. But I think at the end of the day, probably the generations that we will have people in aeroplanes probably doesn't outlast the time it would take to have a gender-neutral cockpit design, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So the equipment, what you're wearing, that can be done quicker. But,
yes.
But actually, just the sheer length of time that an aircraft is out there flying,
yes,
can't make those adjustments.
I mean, to put it in perspective, Typhoon was designed 40 years ago, and it's only really been in service for 20 years. So, and it's going to be in service for another 20. So that's the sort of timeline we're talking about. So I think probably that's a bridge too far. But I think kit for sure is coming, which is fantastic. Because actually, day to day, you interact with your kit a lot more. And that gives you the comfort. You wear it day to day. You know, you're not necessarily in the cockpit all day, every day. So any win is a win.
Yeah, and it goes further than that as well in terms of the escape system, so the ejector seats. So the minimum weight for the ejector seats, I think for Typhoon, I wouldn't have been able to fly in Typhoon because the seat limits were different to the Tornado. And again, when we think about inclusivity, it would probably rule out quite a large proportion of the female population just because of the weight, the minimum weight limit that you had to be within the limits for the seats. So there are, I suppose, lots of moving parts in terms of it's the aircraft design, it's the escape systems, it's the kit that goes in the aircraft. If we could bring it all together, it would be brilliant. But I suppose, like Helen says, at least there's moves afoot to look at the kit side of things. If they can look at escape systems, if they can look at the aircraft design, then amazing. But we may be, still a number of years off that.
So military aviation is hugely physically demanding. Can you tell me a little bit about the unique physical demands that you experienced?
So I would say just wearing the kit is quite an experience because it's quite heavy, it's cumbersome, and it's hot. Getting in the jet, breathing pressurized air because you pressure breathe against the G, and we're talking sort of longitudinal G rather than potentially the different G that the Formula One drivers will face. But I know that they're pulling sustained or experiencing sustained G for 2 or 3 hours. In a 1 hour sortie, I might pull 9G, which obviously is hard and tiring and aerobically. I mean, you feel like you've done a gym session when you come down because you're sweating and you're out of breath and your muscles hurt. But I may only pull that for sort of 3 seconds to 20 seconds every few minutes. So it's not potentially as sustained as it might be in a Formula One aircraft. But all of those things combined, for me or for us, any fast jet pilot is like, yeah, of course, that's just us getting in the jet, flying the jet and landing. It's really quite alien for your body, I think, as a physical experience. G is very hard, it's very tiring. Pulling 9G, and the Typhoon snaps to 9G in less than a second. It's rapid onset. So you are, and just to put that in perspective for those that don't know, that your body is 9 times, or feels 9 times heavier than normal, and most importantly, your head is 9 times heavier with a helmet on. So I would often come back from a combat sortie. If I was instructing, I would be in the back seat. I know Rosie can talk about that because that was her office. But if I was in the back seat and someone's in the front pulling 9G, if I wasn't aware of it, if my head was in the wrong position, ouch. So there were. The only way I can describe it is coming back from a really hard gym session, because it's every single muscle in your body is being used. Your heart is pounding, your adrenaline's racing, and you're really sweaty because you're wearing a big immersion suit.
The blood's rushing in and out your head as well, constantly. So
it's full on.
It's really hard work. It is really hard work, and I suppose different perspectives. So front seat, back seat. So when I was learning air combat, for example, I think it took me about 10 flights to start to get used to the G in terms of I hadn't experienced air sickness before, but once I started air combat, I was like, this is what air sickness is like, and it is horrific, and it's just from sustained G, and I guess it being, again, an alien environment, even though you've flown previously, even though for passengers who've never flown before, and then they go and experience a Typhoon doing 9G, it would blow their mind. But even when you're used to that environment, as Helen says, with all the kit on, when you're feeling hot, you're working hard, your heart rate's up, you feel very heavy when you're pulling all of that G, obviously, and when you're sustaining it. Certainly for me, one of the biggest physical challenges was air sickness, and something that I had to work quite hard to overcome. But my body, I suppose, over time, with exposure and experience, became desensitized to it. So fortunately for me, I was able to work through it, because at the time when you're feeling sick in an aircraft, you still have to perform well. You still have to be able to perform at that standard, because at the end of the day, you're still being assessed. You can still fail a trip. So if you're unable to check the fuel, if you're unable to check the height of the aircraft, the speed of the aircraft, your location, if you can't do those things, then you can't safely look after yourself and the crew in that aircraft. So you have to be able to perform well even when you're feeling unwell. That was something I had to certainly work through, and it just came with experience. And as I say, I gradually became desensitized. But I know for some people in that environment, they never really got over it, and they would feel sick. And if there was some of them got sent on a course to try and desensitize them to the sickness, which was essentially a centrifuge where they'd get spun round and round and round, and they do that every day, twice a day for a month, I believe. Right. And one of the guys that was on my course told me it was the worst time of his life, because he said, all I do is I go to work and I'm made physically sick twice a day, every day. And he said he never really got over it. So it had desensitized him to an extent, but then if he ever took time off away from work, if he was on a course or on leave, and he came back into the work environment, he would have to work through it again, and he'd have to desensitize himself to it again. So he never really got over it. And it's really debilitating for people. So a different type of G perhaps, but from a physical perspective, it's one that's really draining. It can be really draining and tiring.
So you talked about the centrifuge, which sounds absolutely dreadful. What other training, or was there any training that prepared you for the way in which your body was going to be stressed?
I mean, they talked about an anti-G straining manoeuvre where you could physically sort of clench your muscles to try and help you maintain G tolerance, but it was quite basic, and it wasn't really sort of demonstrated to you. It was just, you were just sort of told about it, and then you just had to experience it and trial and error.
I mean, we did have kit that helped us. So you have anti-G trousers, and in the Typhoon you had a jacket as well. And obviously the reasoning behind that is that you are trying to prevent loss of consciousness, because the blood would normally under G drain from your head down into your legs, and the anti-G kit would combat this by pushing it back up. So it would allow you to sustain more G without losing consciousness, which is great, and it saved a lot of people. So you weren't alone, and you did have that. Yeah. But I would say that there was aircrew conditioning, which was essentially weights, but there wasn't often time in the day to do it. Yeah. And I think
you knew you should go to the gym and do things, but if it's difficult when you're doing, if you're in work for 12 hours to then fit it in on top of everything else in life and everything else around work. So it was a kind of a nice to have, as opposed to you must do this. It's really important for your physical health.
But I would suggest that any sort of future program, when you are in such a high performing piece of equipment, that actually that is front and foremost of everyone's training program.
Is the kit, and certainly with the G pants, I can vouch for the fact that they're pretty effective in terms of. I flew in the back seat of a Red Arrows once just to experience it, and you weren't allowed to wear G pants because they could potentially provide a control restriction. So you had to do the whole sortie with no G pants at all, and it was pretty horrid to experience that without when you're used to having that kit there to help you. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, elite athletes now would do an awful lot of training in preparation for that. You might be in an environmental chamber, for example, and doing training under the heat, the temperature that you would be exposed to. It sounds for you two that actually a lot of a lot of that was done on the job.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
up there.
Yeah, just get on. We were just told get on with it, really.
So I would offer that a training program almost needs to be moulded around that, because I think that's so important. And I mean, unfortunately, I ended up getting medically discharged because of a neck injury that I sustained because of, long lasting exposure to G and sitting in a cockpit with not necessarily the provision of care that would have been required. And I think that needs to be almost the cornerstone, the physical fitness, because if you're physically fit and you are able and normalized to it, again, it's that capacity. You don't have to worry about that. You can just take that for granted and deal with everything else.
How have you handled the sort of media, being in the public eye, and some of the gender stereotypes that come with that? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I think this is probably the trickiest part. We're very lucky in that in the military as an individual, you don't necessarily on a day-to-day basis have to embrace it or deal with it, just because necessarily the classification of what you're doing or the circumstances that you are operating in means that you can't. And I understand that obviously in Formula One, that is not the case, because as an individual, you need to get sponsorship, you need to garner public interest, so it's a different beast. But I have one example of media scrutiny. So again, I hark back to my time on operations in Libya, and I was flying, I landed, neither did we, as we were saying earlier on, but I landed, got out of the jet, gave the jet back to the engineers, went home, thought nothing of it. The next day I wake up and my phone is ablaze with text messages, emails and phone calls from everyone I know saying, oh my goodness, Helen, you need to see this. And I quickly go onto the internet and I am in every single newspaper under the sun in the UK. And to put that in context, I was flying on the third mission in LME that the UK had flown in, and the previous mission, an American aircraft had been lost. We didn't know at the time why, but obviously tensions were a little bit high. So then fast forward to my mum, now having reporters around her house because they want to get the scoop from the first female Typhoon pilot to fly on operations that's been in the newspaper. The pressure's on for her as well. She's already worried because she knows that a jet has been lost. She knows that her daughter is on operations for the first time, and that's pretty, a high pressure situation. And so all of that was really my first experience of media scrutiny, and it wasn't very pleasant because, again, it just distracted all of us, because the other guys on the squadron were felt really bad for me because they hadn't been singled out. I had, because I was a female. And what was really interesting, though, is when I came home, I had a proper look. This was, a month or two later when I returned from operations. And I looked at all of the comments from the general public on those newspaper articles. And there was no single comment about brilliant work, well done, all these guys are so brave, they're, doing their job. It was about my hair colour. And that was actually a really good lesson. And it really helped me come to terms with it, because I just realised that every single person has an opinion. And they can now voice their opinion. But they don't know me, they don't know my friends, they don't know the job I'm doing, and they don't know how hard we're all working to get the job done. And it kind of made me feel a bit better about it, because yes, they've got an opinion, but that's all it is. And I would offer the same advice to any girl probably starting on this journey, is that I think it's really important for them to have someone who is trained and well-versed in dealing with that and mentoring them through it, because I think that they will need the help of someone to know which bits to take on board and which bits to just go, that's just someone having an opinion because they want to have one, and it doesn't matter to me. It's not going to affect how I work and how I perform.
Yeah, I think that extends from the instructional perspective. When I was talking before about you can look at what you can control, you let the rest of it go, and that's where you focus your attention. And when you see all those little comments, as you learned, we need to let them go, because it's just it's Joe Public's opinion. There's nothing we can do about it. However, the line is crossed, I think, when if it's a media outlet, it's a larger organisation, if they are starting to voice opinions which are detrimental, derogatory due to an attribute you have as a female, for example, as opposed to your ability to do the job, then there's accountability there, and that needs calling out. And I think there are occasions when it's worth challenging that opinion and that narrative, because that will influence people's thoughts in the public, that will influence people's behaviours and how they go on to project their views. So I think it's, as Helen has said, there are things you need to just let go, and then there are other things that you do need to hold to account.
Yeah. What advice would you give to parents of daughters who are thinking about pursuing a career that's maybe traditionally been more male-dominated?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it kind of took me aback when my mum said that. So I would probably say just be cautious of discouraging. I think you have to, there needs to be some realism, and I think that's different from discouragement. But I think I would just say, just be really careful to put someone off, or at least do your research before you do. I think you need to have some evidence behind that to be able to say no.
Yeah. If you limit their beliefs, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy anyway. So it's, I think, from my perspective, if you can be there to encourage and support, again, within realism. But I mean, I was told various times that I was too small, too light. You know, you can say to people, you're too young, you're too inexperienced, but ultimately that's someone else's limit. It's not your own limit. And I think we set our own limits, and that's what we need to do. We need to test our limits. We need to push those boundaries, because that's how we learn, that's how we innovate, that's how we make change happen. So I think it's really important to try and encourage as much as we can within that sort of bound of realism. But I guess for some people that it's difficult to know where that line is. Mm-hmm. So let's push it.
So I think, you know, recently we've become aware that mentoring, it's really important for women working in high pressure environments. It's becoming a lot more common to see that happen. What role did mentoring play in your careers?
So, I mean, I think everyone needs a wingman, and you have one weakness when you're flying, and that's your 6 o'clock. You cannot physically see what's behind you, and that's when you need a wingman or a friend who can spot those threats, who can spot those weaknesses even before you know about them yourself. They can point them out to you as a mentor, they can coach you, they can guide you, but in a constructive and supportive way. I think it's a really powerful thing in terms of them helping you become that best version of yourself. And Helen and I have said to each other, you know, in terms of debriefing as well, it's something that we still do, and as a peer level, we'll go away from this conversation today and we will talk about what we've explained well, what we could have explained better, because it's all about learning and improving. And I think having that mentoring system is just so key, so that people can relate to other people, they can tell them their problems, as I say, at that peer level, but also to share concerns and worries and to help each other out and guide them. And you're mentoring at the moment.
Yeah. And I think what's also really important about a mentor is the ability to have empathy, because you've been there, you've been through it, and you probably know what they're feeling, and you can picture how they're feeling, and you can therefore offer advice or guidance based on that. And I think that's really important as well, isn't it?
Yeah, the just being heard. Yeah, and understood.
And not having that feeling of loneliness, vulnerability, and thinking, am I just going mad, or is this something that is perfectly normal to feel?
Yeah, and I think also, you know, particularly for the girls, sort of traditionally we've been told, even from a young age, you look at fairy tales, and I mean, Little Red Riding Hood's a classic example of, as a young girl, she's told to stay on the path, you know, don't make any trouble, don't make a fuss, don't stray away from where you should be. And it's just that narrative that's driven of you know, you must conform, you must follow the rules, which I think is different for boys. And it's, I think, about changing that narrative and challenging that narrative and saying, actually, we need to be pushing those boundaries, we need to be taking those risks, because if we don't do it, things will not change. So I think it's trying to drive that change and change that narrative.
Helen, Rosie, thank you so much for your time. I'm sure people watching this can see the many parallels between F1 and your experiences. And to those watching, thank you so much for tuning into our next session of Track Talks, and we'll hope to see you at the next one soon.